NBC had quite to live up to, considering that at the start of 1980, Fred Silverman was still in charge of television programming. Or did they? See, NBC's fortunes hadn't changed for the better upon Fred's arrival at the network. Even with a select team backing him, NBC was a distant third in the Nielsen ratings board. So Fred did something that shook NBC to its core. He decided to walk away from the position and instead set up his own production company. In other words, he quit the television programming business. Now the top seat at the table was vacant and someone had to take the reins. Soon enough, a successor had stepped forward to lead the charge. That man was none other than Brandon Tartikoff, a man who had gotten his start in Chicago and soon worked for ABC during the 1970s. He would migrate to NBC in 1977, taking the next step in his career. So, what would Brandon do to make an impact on NBC? Well, he had done something that even Fred couldn't do at the time, making NBC a success. See, Brandon would be responsible for ushering in such shows as The Cosby Show, Hill Street Blues, Miami Vice, and Cheers. All of these shows had one thing in common. They ended up being the top Nielsen-ranked shows at the time. So as far as NBC was concerned, Brandon was their new man with the golden gut. This was definitely warranted because by the end of the 1980s, NBC, which was always in last place, finished first in the Nielsen ratings 68 weeks in a row. That was unprecedented at the time, but that was primetime television. So, how did Brandon pan out with NBC's Saturday morning lineup? Well, let's put it this way. NBC definitely had something to offer better than ever before. Well, not at first. See, the network really didn't offer much outside of what they had during the latter half of 1979. Cartoons such as Fred and Barney Meets the Shmoo had Hanna-Barbera splicing two previous offerings to pass off as new content. The network continued their output of Looney Tunes cartoons in the form of the Daffy Duck Show. Godzilla was now paired with Hong Kong Phooey, making his NBC debut in rerun status, of course. To top it off, they even managed to pair Dynamite with Godzilla as well. As for Filmation, they managed to pair Batman and the Super 7 to continue their Superpower output. To make a long story short, NBC was taking reruns from the other networks and placing them on their lineup. It seemed as if NBC's Saturday morning lineup had become an afterthought, but in the fall of 1981, NBC decided that enough was enough. The gloves were now off. They were now on a mission to make their Saturday morning cartoon lineup the most viable of the big three. So, what did they premiere during that fall season? Well, one of them was something that would make a huge difference upon its arrival. Better yet, let me just show you. Here it is, the Smurfs. They shouldn't need much of an introduction, considering that they were already covered in the history of Hanna-Barbera Part 2. But nevertheless, there is more to the story than what was presented there. For instance, the Smurfs' journey to Saturday mornings was quite an interesting tale itself. It all started out as a proposal brought on by Margaret Loesch. That's right, the very same Margaret Loesch that later went on to work at Marvel Productions. But around this time, she was an executive in production at Hanna-Barbera. She needed a man that could bring it to fruition. She gave that opportunity to Gerard Baldwin, a man that had quite the experience himself. Having previously worked on Rocky and His Friends for J. Ward Productions in 1959, he lent his services to Hanna-Barbera, where he worked on cartoons such as the Fantastic Four, and Super Friends. But by this time, he had gotten tired of doing shows like these and wanted to try his hand at something new. The Smurfs was the opportunity that he was waiting for. But bringing the Smurfs to television wasn't an easy task. Gerard had to reassure the creator of the Smurfs, Peyo, that his creation was in good hands at the studio. Also, he had to deal with the aftermath of the contract signings for the series, as it quickly went into production soon after. To pull it off, he was going to need a lot of talent, so he made the decision to bring on Lan Jansen and Chuck Menville to convert the comic books into scripts for the show. But they soon realized that the source material was quite limited. So Gerard decided to bring on a writer by the name of Michael Reeves. Michael was quite an experienced writer for animation. Prior to being brought on board, he had worked mostly with filmation and scripted cartoons such as Shazam, Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, and Space Sentinels, to name a few. He would also go on later to write several episodes for the aforementioned Muppet Babies and Dungeons & Dragons. This ended up being a great decision by the team because Michael Reeves ended up writing 63 stories for the first 2 seasons. Many others, such as Floyd Norman, James T. Walker, Volos Jones, and Ed Love had come on board. These 4 men had one thing in common. They were former animators at Disney. So with this pedigree of writers and animators working steadfastly in its creation, it's easy to say that the Smurfs premiered on September 12, 1981 to immediate success. But it begs the question, how big of a hit it was? Well, by the end of the 1981-82 season, the Smurfs was one of the most watched shows on television. And not only that, it had reaped the benefits of mass merchandising. Toys and dolls couldn't stay on shelves long enough. Smurf Mania was underway, and NBC was much obliged to meet demand. It had gotten to a point where NBC banked their whole Saturday morning lineup on the Smurfs. It had expanded to 60 minutes in the second season. By the third season, it was a whopping 90 minutes. As you can imagine, the series had to be streamlined to meet that demand. In fact, an average episode went from premise to outline, then storyboarded, recording voiceovers to finished product, all in the span of 6 to 8 weeks. This was entirely unprecedented in television animation. But that was how popular the series had gotten on the lineup. The Smurfs was NBC's trump card, to say the least. And if you think that was big enough for the network, well, that wouldn't be the case by a long shot. The network had another offering for that fall season. This one featured the return of a character who once graced Saturday mornings before, and now he was back and brand new for the 80s. A comic book icon.
SpiderMan and his amazing friends, Iceman and Firestar.
Here he is, back on television screens. The children of America could witness his amazing feats once again. His comeback to Saturday morning television, Spider-Man. This time, Spider-Man had come from a proper place, Marvel Productions. This came at the start of Cadence Industries, which owned Marvel, purchased the Patty Freeling Enterprises, and relaunching it as such. With David H. DePatie still at the helm, they meant business. It wasn't called Marvel Productions for nothing. Those who worked at Marvel also had an active role somewhere in the company, such as Stan Lee. As for Spider-Man, he was already languishing in live-action segments on PBS's Electric Company series to educate the youth of America. But with the new initiative of Marvel Productions in the animation space, Spider-Man was primed for a comeback to Saturday mornings, and he did on that day of September 12, 1981, in his third animated series. Notice that I said third. Well, that's for a good reason. See, around this time, the syndicated market had started to gain momentum as a platform for content that couldn't get onto network television. Marvel Productions decided to take their shot at syndication with the series aptly titled Spider-Man, of course. This series was the studio's attempt to truly replicate the comics by emulating John Romita Sr.'s run with the material. His iteration of Spider-Man was hugely popular at the time, with even the character appearing in his own comic strip. This was due to the contributions of Donald F. Glut, who had played a part in writing for Marvel at the time, and Christy Marks, who was a superfan making her dream come true by writing comics. But of course, Destiny had stepped in and she became a writer for animation instead. This series had Peter Parker as a college student attending Empire State University and working for the Daily Bugle on the side while trying to contend with the likes of his usual rogue gallery. But whereas Spider-Man had the freedom of telling its story due to the looser nature of syndication, Spider-Man and his amazing friends had Dennis Marks mostly at the helm. His approach to bringing Spider-Man to Saturday mornings conflicted with what Glut envisioned the character as. According to Glut, he once said that in addition to writing and crafting the Spider-Man episodes for syndication, which was solely created to add to the 1966 anime series for a syndicated package, he had to approach writing for network television differently. This meant toning down key elements of the lore. To make it more interesting for the network, they added the titular Amazing Friends into the fold. First was Bobby Drake, aka Iceman, who was Peter's roommate and a mutant. That's right, this was their very first appearance in animation. Then you had Angelica Jones, aka Firestar, a character specifically made for this series. And as her name implied, she had the power to wield fire. When it was time for them to spring into action, their dorm room turned into a high-tech crime-fighting lab. This addition to the series was loathed by the animation director at Marvel Productions, Bob Richardson, and Glut himself. They both felt that it contradicted the nature of the character, considering Peter was a very meager college student that had a hard time just getting by. The lab didn't make any sense to them, but this was added at the behest of NBC. And guess what? They didn't like the dog as well. The idea was Dennis Marks, of course. This series had Spider-Man, Iceman, and Firestar facing off against Spidey's rogue gallery and some created for the series such as Video Man. The season ended up being a sizable hit for NBC's Saturday morning lineup, enough to warrant them a second season of only 3 episodes. This short episode order was the price of the studio making another anime series for the lineup. The Incredible Hulk. That's right, Marvel's Mean Green Behemoth was back on Saturday mornings and paired with Spider-Man in a Superpower block as The Incredible Hulk and the Amazing Spider-Man. Unfortunately, Marvel Productions had put their main attention on Incredible Hulk, which led them to only produce 3 episodes for the second season. This attempt to push the Incredible Hulk only lasted that initial 13-episode run. So the team had went back to producing more episodes of Spider-Man and his Amazing Friends. 8 to be exact. And that was it. The series would end up in reruns on NBC's Saturday morning lineup from 1984 to 1986. In all, Spider-Man had swung his way back to Saturday mornings once more. But that wouldn't be the last time he reared his head. But in 1981, SpiderMan helped make NBC's Saturday morning lineup important. Little did kids know, this was the beginning of the re-emerging of superhero cartoons. Just as Uncle Ben always said, with great power comes great responsibility. In that aspect, Spider-Man and his amazing friends fulfilled both on Saturday mornings. Excelsior.
Well, the world may be filled with scorpions and arachnoids and whatever, but we'll take Spider-Man.
NBC had even more to offer during the 1981 season and onward. For instance, one might think that Filmation was done with network television, but that wasn't the case entirely. Case in point, they offered NBC the Kid Superpower Hour with Shazam. That's right, Shazam was back on Saturday mornings, and this time animated. But this wasn't his show to go at alone. He was joined by another cartoon, Hero High, an anime series that had came about from an early concept pitch to adapt the Super Archie comic segments to animation. Filmation decided to take that pitch that Fred Silverman had left on the table. Here, it was given new life as an anime offering for NBC's Saturday morning lineup in 1981. The premise had 5 superpowered teens attending a high school for superheroes, ran by a former superhero turned principal named Samson. These superpowered teens were Captain California, Glorious Gal, Rex Ruthless, Dirty Trixie, and Weatherman, who resembled their comic counterparts, Archie, Betty, Reggie, Veronica, and Jughead respectively. As for Shazam, he was finally able to display his full superheroics as he took from the pages of the comics, even featuring the entire Marvel family and villains such as Black Adam. These 2 anime series were accompanied by a Filmation staple, the live-action musical segment. Filmation used the same formula that they previously used for Archie's Funhouse, to a point where they wanted to position Kid Superpower as a major commodity with merchandising and such. But that wouldn't be the case for Filmation. This was 1984, and times had changed. Live-action shows such as Benji, Jax, and the Prince weren't exactly popular amongst the young audience. In other words, it wasn't very successful. By the 1984 season, the Kid Superpower Hour was done with only 1 season ever on air. As for Hanna-Barbera, they brought something quite intriguing to the lineup. Here's Hanna-Barbera's unusual offering for NBC, starring someone quite familiar with the network, Gary Coleman. Gary Coleman had already made moves with his role as Arnold Drummond on the classic sitcom Different Strokes, which was in its 5th season around this time. Winning the Young Artist Award in 1981, he was one of the top young actors of his day. So he was destined for other roles outside of his stint on Different Strokes. Soon he was starring in several television movies. In 1982, he starred in The Kid with the Broken Halo. Starring alongside Robert Guillaume, Gary plays the role of Andy LeBeau, an angel that is a bit of a troublemaker. He is given one more chance at becoming a guardian angel, and if he fails, well, he will go to that other place that's rather unpleasant, to say the least. Andy is tasked with 3 assignments that involve a family and a lonely lady. He must sort things out as a true guardian angel would do. The mention of this movie is very important for only one reason. See, Hanna-Barbera, being a studio that loved taking anything and turning it into a Saturday morning cartoon, had keen interest in this movie. Despite the movie not being much of a hit, This was their gateway to working with one of the biggest child actors on television. Thus, the Gary Coleman Show was born. The animated series was basically a continuation of the movie itself, as it had Andy helping out the citizens of Oakville as a guardian angel, under the supervision of Angelica, of course. Andy would take off his halo and walk amongst the living as a young African-American kid, and of course, voiced by Gary himself. When Andy wasn't fouling things up, Hornswoggle was there to assist him on making all the wrong decisions. And yes, you can take a good guess on who Hornswoggle is. Considering he couldn't be seen by Angelica, I'm pretty sure you can imagine his role in Andy's development. Surprised that Hanna-Barbera were able to slip that past NBC's BS&P department. Oh well. At least Andy had some great friends by his side. When he was blending with the living, he hung out with Bartholomew, a very clumsy kid.
Bart, old buddy, I don't think that's such a good idea, yow!
Lydia, the spoiled rich girl.
Remove yourself. I must go buy a new outfit.
Spence, who was quite the nerd. Tina, his little sister. Haggle, who made sure to rhyme as he spoke.
This is gonna be some kind of party.
Yeah, I'm hale and hearty and ready to party.
And Chris, who was quite the athlete.
Man alive, that was some kind of dive.
Look, Chris saved him.
They mostly had to put up with the likes of Mac, the neighborhood bully. For this outing, Hanna-Barbera outsourced the duties to a studio in Mexico. They did manage to bring on some good writers such as Paul Dini and Tom Ruegger to script episodes of the series. Any fan of cartoons should know of these two, as they would go on to work on The 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo and A Pup Named Scooby-Doo. Speaking of Scooby-Doo, the series also employed the services of Casey Kasem to provide narration for the episodes. Despite all of these elements that guaranteed success on any lineup, this wouldn't be the case for the Gary Coleman Show. The series had gotten only the standard 13 episodes, and that was it. Well, at least for Gary Coleman's tenure on Saturday mornings. He continued on with his role on Different Strokes onto a 6th season and stayed a household name. The series even garnered an NAACP award that season. Since Gary Coleman had gotten older, his character on the sitcom wasn't that cute little kid anymore. So in an attempt to keep the series going, Mr. Drummond got married to a single mother in that season. The new cute kid that took his place, his name was Sam, and he was played by Danny Cooksey. Now, if you don't realize or know who he is, well, let's just say that going forward, he will play an active role in the animation space. But that's years down the line, of course. We will see him again in due time. As for the series, it was canceled at the end of the 7th season, but in an attempt to bolster its lineup, ABC had taken the series onto its network and moved it to Friday nights. Anyone with knowledge of television programming knows that Friday and Saturday were the least watched nights on television around this time. So it's no surprise that the move to a different network couldn't save the series. It was canceled at the end of its 8th season. That was it. As for Gary Coleman himself, things didn't bode very well for him later on in life, but that's a story to be told by someone else. But for kids in 1982, Gary reflected who they were at the time. They will always remember him being the kid who tried to do the right thing and had the gift of laughter to provide us with. His heavenly deed was to entertain the children of America on Saturday mornings. Great job, Andy. Those wings were well deserved, my friend. Speaking of Different Strokes, That sixth season's premiere episode had a very special guest star that was quite interesting. The episode itself was very well received because of him. His stock was high around this time. So with the help of a studio that was starting to find its footing in the animation space, it was time to bring kids across America his debut on Saturday mornings. So you must be wondering, who is this guy that I speak of? Well, take a look. Here he is. Lo and behold, representation at its finest. Before the term was even considered a thing. The heavy chain-wearing, mohawk-haired, tough guy himself, Mr. T. Yes, the very same guy who had quite the presence as B.A. Baracus in the hit TV series, The A-Team, as mentioned previously. But before his success on television, he had got his start growing up in Southside Chicago. Born Lawrence Thoreau to a minister and his loving wife, he grew up with 12 siblings in the home. So you can imagine that standing out was very important to him as a youngster. He did just that as he dabbled in football and wrestling in high school, even going as far as becoming a 3-time wrestling champion in the process. These athletic accolades carried him into college. Prairie View A&M University to be exact. However, his tenure in college was quite short-lived, as he was expelled from the university. Never being a man who ever quit on himself, he enrolled in the United States Army, where he served as a military policeman, an MP. After he left the service, he decided to go to work as a nightclub bouncer. This was a last resort for him, considering previously he had gone to a tryout for the Green Bay Packers, but due to a knee injury, those dreams were dashed quickly. This was it for him, but fortunately, this proved to be a great option. By then, he was going by the name of Mr. T. He legally changed his name to this because he wanted the respect that his father, uncle, and his brother couldn't get as an African American living in America. He wanted people to always address him as Mr., and there was no way that you were disrespecting him. Mr. T was quite successful as a bouncer for a reason. This toughness led him to be a bodyguard for several celebrities such as Michael Jackson, Steve McQueen, Diana Ross, and even the champ himself, Muhammad Ali. His tenure as a bodyguard would pay off in a huge way when he caught the attention of a major player in Hollywood at the time, Sylvester Stallone. He would go on to cast him in Rocky III for the role of Clubber Lang. By now, it's common knowledge how successful the movie was at the time. The success of Rocky III led him to his other successful role in 1983's DC Cab. Speaking of 1983, this is when he finally catapulted to TV stardom with The A-Team. The series ended up becoming one of the most watched shows on television that year. Mr. T, in particular, became very popular with an unlikely demographic: kids. Brandon Tartikoff knew he had lightning in a bottle with Mr. T. So he, along with Steven Gerber and Martin Pasco, set forth to bring him to the Saturday morning audience, to create an animated series that fit who Mr. T was. To fulfill that vision, the animation duties were handled by none other than Ruby Spears Enterprises. This was Mr. T's chance for a new kind of stardom, and the studio was much obliged to bring him to life in animation. So, what was this series about? Well, it starred a very accurate depiction of Mr. T, even down to his signature gold chains. This was Ruby Spears at the height of their tenure as a studio. In this series, Mr. T was a gymnastics instructor working with a group of teenagers as a part of a traveling gymnastics team. But in between competing worldwide, the team got into various adventures and mysteries. Accompanying him was Robin, her little brother Spike, Kim, Jeff, Woody, Vince, Miss Bibsby, the bus driver who loved to read, and of course, being a Saturday morning cartoon, a pet companion has to be a part of the cast. That being Dozer, who strangely looked like Mr. T, with a mohawk of its own. Talk about pets resembling their owners. Mr. T and his team went out and saved the day. The man himself didn't only premiere on television screens on Saturday mornings in animated form, he also opened up the episode with him talking in a live access segment to introduce the audience to the theme of the episode. On top of that, he also managed to disperse a moral lesson at the end of each episode as well. The series leaned on Mr. T being a role model to the kids on his team and those in real life viewing at home. This was really important to him as he donated his time in real life to helping the youth. So, how did it fare on NBC's Saturday morning lineup? Very well for the network.
I know Cool, and Cool's teaming up with a good balanced breakfast. Teaming up with Mr. T.
It had proven to be so much of a success, it had garnered several merchandising. He even got his own cereal from Quaker Oats, for goodness sake. Appearing alongside Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 1, Mr. T was riding high on his success. The series would get 2 more seasons on the network. Mr. T had proven no matter how many times you fail or where you come from, you can still be a success and be a role model for kids in need of one. The animated series would languish in reruns on cable. Here. Yeah, we will get to that bridge when we cross it. Today, Mr. T is still out there, helping kids in the neighborhood that he once grew up in. Still being the icon, but in 1983, Saturday mornings had a dose of warm-hearted toughness, and it was all the better for it. Now, I always wondered how heavy those chains really were. That's Mr. T for you.
Now she knows what it takes to be a good leader. Patience, planning, and participation. Good leaders know what they can do, and they know what others can do better. They share the work and share the credit. The point is to get the job done, and done right, not to hog the glory by doing it all yourself. Take it from me, Mr. T.
Ruby Spears Enterprises and NBC weren't done bringing cartoons to the lineup just yet. In fact, this would only be just the beginning. In the fall of 1983, they sought to revive a cartoon that was long overdue for a return to television screens. Better yet, a rebirth. A cartoon that could fit in this era perfectly. So, what was this cartoon that I speak of? Well, you might already know what it is already. But just in case you don't, let me roll the footage.
Watch out, 'cause here we come. It's been a while, but we're back with style, so to have some fun, we'll bring you action and satisfaction.
This is it. Their return to the animation space. Their long-awaited return for a new generation. Alvin and the Chipmunks. After Alvin show's short short run on television, it had continued to languish on Saturday mornings off and on in reruns, even as late as 1979. Unfortunately, in 1972, Ross Bagdasarian had passed away due to a heart attack. His legacy was born from his drive to make it in the business, despite his ethnic background not widely accepted in the industry. The franchise had laid dormant since the Alvin show's cancellation when Ross decided to retire from the business and spent his years at his winery. Fast forward to 1980. Los Angeles, the city of angels. The location, KMET. This was a radio station, and on one night in LA, a DJ there had played the Blondie record, Call Me, that was sped up. The DJ had joked around that it was a new Chipmunks record. Apparently, he soon found out that the people actually liked the record, and they kept on requesting it. They were clamoring to hear the Chipmunks again. The three singing rodents that most had adored growing up. This in turn prompted one unlikely person to come out of the woodwork to meet the demands of the people. His name was Ross Bagdasarian Jr. That's right, Ross's own son. He stepped up to the plate to continue what his father had started. He did so by releasing Chipmunk Punk in June of that year. Despite the title of the album having punk in it, the LP mostly had covers of songs that leaned toward new wave and pop rock. And yes, that same Blondie record was the lead single off the album. Despite the critics panning it, the album had managed to go gold. Ross would follow it up with a second album, Urban Chipmunk. This time it was an album filled with country songs, and it also managed to go gold as well. The Chipmunks were back in the limelight, but there was one spot they truly need to return to: animation. Ross Jr., along with his wife, Janice Carmen, aimed to do just that. They shopped the idea of reviving the Chipmunks to NBC. Ross Jr. had everything riding on this, despite him already honoring his father's request to get a degree in law. But his true calling was following in the footsteps of his dad. To test the waters on the network, they soon formed Bagdasarian Productions and released their first outing with the Chipmunks, A Chipmunk Christmas, a special making its debut on December 14th, 1981. A full 20 years from the debut of the Alvin show, this special had the Chipmunks trying to do what they did best: make music. Christmas music for this outing. It has Alvin trying to get a harmonica to replace the prized one that he gives away to a girl so she can give it to her sick brother as a Christmas gift. The special was a collaboration with Chuck Jones Enterprises. Yes, that Chuck Jones, helming his own studio at the time. Knowing the prowess of Chuck Jones, the immediate changes to the characters were at full display. They were animated beautifully with softer features, freckles, and the expressive facial expressions that were his signature. Well, technically, this was a product of Phil Monroe, who was quite the veteran animator, animating many of the Warner Brothers Looney Tunes shorts, such as Yankee Doodle Daffy, Watts Cookin' Doc, and his work on the Bugs Bunny Road Runner movie. The special also featured Christmas staples such as It's Beginning to Look a Lot Like Christmas and Here Comes Santa Claus. Suffice it to say, the special ended up becoming a great success on the network, which was on par for almost any anime special back then. A certain cartoon feline would also benefit from this prestige as well. 2 years later, after the special debuted, NBC was finally ready to give the Chipmunks a shot at Saturday morning stardom. This time, with the help of Ruby Spears Enterprises, Ross Jr. and Janice were finally ready to take Bagdasarian Productions to a whole new plateau. Thus, Alvin and the Chipmunks were back on screens and in a brand new way. This being the 80s, it was expected to have the vibe of that era. Ross and Janice had taken what Ross Sr. had done and reinvented it for a new audience. As they say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. That was Alvin and the Chipmunks in a nutshell. No pun intended. Alvin is still the show's star, always getting his brothers into one of his shenanigans, and catching the ire of Dave Seville in the process.
Alvin! Alvin!
Speaking of Dave, his look had drastically changed to make him look a bit younger. Still a single dad as always. Then you have Simon, the brainy kid who excelled in academics, dabbled in science experiments, and was always quite aware of Alvin's scheming. And lastly, you had Theodore, the cute and chubby little brother who had an unnerving love of food. These three got into various situations, whether it was trying to navigate their time in school, fending off the scheming of Uncle Harry, or just trying to land a musical gig. Speaking of music, the musical montages were back and better than ever. The Chipmunks belted tunes from music artists of the era and even sang their own original music. Janice Carmen decided to throw her creative ideas into the series as well. Well, one. That being none other than the Chipettes. Having escaped an orphanage in Australia to come to America, they would land in the care of Miss Miller. The Chipettes were quite the unique bunch of characters. The Chipettes consisted of Brittany, Jeanette, and Eleanor, who happened to be counterparts of Alvin, Simon, and Theodore, respectively. They also got into their own shenanigans, and you can guess who got them in those in the first place. They were also quite the band as well, a girl band, very capable of hanging with the Chipmunks vocally. They also had their own musical numbers as well. The Chipettes and the Chipmunks. Well, Alvin and Brittany mostly tried to compete with each other to see who was the best. Alvin and the Chipmunks managed to do something the Alvin Show had failed to do. Become an instant hit. By 1984, the Chipmunks were a hot commodity. Adorning several merchandise, NBC had found lightning in a bottle for the third time in a row. The series had grown so popular that an album was made to capitalize off its success. Songs from our TV show, to be exact. With the success of Alvin and the Chipmunks, NBC was finally in a great place across the board. Despite the climate of Saturday morning programming in general, this was only the beginning of things to come for the series and NBC going forward into the latter half of the 1980s. Alvin and the Chipmunks would later play a greater role on Saturday mornings. This was it. They were back, just like they said in the theme song. Watch out, here they come. It's been a while, but they were back in style. In their case, no truer words were ever spoken. As the 1980s raged on, the times were changing ever so drastically. For instance, Reagan would be sworn in for a second term in the White House. With that second term came his fair share of controversy. I speak of the famous scandal that became synonymous with his administration, the Iran-Contra affair. A scandal that involved Oliver North using funds made from weapon sales to Iran back to the Contras, a faction that was trying to overthrow the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, all in the fight against communism. The conflict lasted well into 1989. But at least Ronald Reagan was instrumental in what was the beginning of the end of the Cold War, when he and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty in 1987. This was an agreement that saw the dismantling of all nuclear and conventional missiles. So that stood for something, right? As on par for the course, these conflicts affected pop culture, particularly movies and television. As for the fabric of the nation itself, things were mostly as they were during the earlier part of the 1980s. But this doesn't mean that the country itself wasn't going through changes. Let's take television for instance. The climate of primetime dramas was shifting in a new direction, and the latter half of the decade would bring in a new concept to the medium: genre television. So, what is genre television exactly? Well, despite the term not having an official description, the concept did exist. Basically, it's mostly described as television catering specifically to a niche audience. Well, the concept wasn't entirely new around this time, with limited series such as 1978's Battlestar Galactica and 1984's V, which premiered on ABC and NBC respectively. But it would be the late 80s when it started to become peak television. Case in point, the return of Star Trek. Dubbed the New Generation, Star Trek returned to an unlikely place: syndication. Yes, that. See, around this time, syndication had become a major player and a second option for viewers to catch reruns of the network's offerings and television programming made specifically for that market. Star Trek: The New Generation ended up becoming a product of that. As for the series itself, it had taken 78 years after Captain Kirk and his crew had boldly gone where no man had gone before. Now it was time for a new captain to explore the uncharted regions of the universe. That captain was Jean-Luc Picard, played by Patrick Stewart. This also brought back Gene Roddenberry into the fold, but mostly as a producer. The new man at the helm was Rick Berman. The series came off the success that Star Trek: The Motion Picture and its subsequent sequels had gained at the box office. This new crew that inhabited the Enterprise were more diverse than any had ever been, including a Klingon amongst them, a race that once warred with humans, now in peaceful negotiation with one another. That Klingon was Lieutenant Worf, played by Michael Dorn. The crew also had the likes of Data, an android, Geordi LaForge, played by the great LeVar Burton, Deanna Troi, and Picard's right-hand man, William Riker. The series even managed to have the likes of Whoopi Goldberg and Majel Barrett as guest appearances as well. Star Trek: The Next Generation became an overnight success, and many syndicated stations had anchored their programming around it. The masses had clamored for Star Trek's return to television, and they embraced it. It brought back a vision of the future that was once touched upon in the original series and a sense of optimism. The series would become the blueprint for what was ahead in the world of syndication, ushering in a slew of new shows priming to take advantage of the syndicated market, with new offerings. This would only be the beginning of Star Trek's revival to television. As for the networks, CBS would revive a classic series for the 80s era, a reimagining. Here it is, The Twilight Zone, back on CBS in a new way, and without Rod Serling at the helm, as he had passed away in 1975, a full 10 years prior to this series' debut. This new iteration of The Twilight Zone had came off the box office success of the movie adaptation that had the likes of John Landis and Steven Spielberg directing remade segments of the classic series and new ones for the film, such as Kick the Can and Time Out, respectively. The film was a commercial success, earning $42 million at the box office. CBS decided that they wanted to bring it back to television, and thus it was revived. In the place of Rod Serling narrating the episodes was Charlie Aidman, whom himself had starred in 2 episodes of the original series, and When the Sky Was Open and Little Girl Lost, by the way. The series also managed to snag many veteran writers to script episodes such as Harlan Ellison, Ray Bradbury, and Stephen King. The series was now presented in a 1-hour format, broken into 2 or 3 segments per episode. For the first season, of course. As with the original series' 4th season, this format hadn't proved to be successful, so it was shortened to 30 minutes in the second season. Unfortunately, The Twilight Zone didn't become the success that CBS had hoped for, so it was canceled after only 2 seasons. But in a move that would be quite common on TV at the time, The Twilight Zone had gotten a 3rd season in syndication. That's right, syndication it went. See, this was the practice of taking a canceled series and producing additional episodes to sell as a syndicated package. In Twilight Zone's case, that ended up being 33 half hours that was now produced out of Canada and story edited by the one and only J. Michael Straczynski. This practice had also brought several shows that emulated the Twilight Zone, such as Tales from the Dark Side, conjured up from the mind of John Romero when he couldn't make his classic horror film Creepshow into a TV series. This was followed by Monsters and Paramount's own horror attempt in syndication, Friday the 13th, a series that only resembled the classic slasher films by name. Whereas syndication had gone left field in terms of content, the networks had mostly stuck what they already had established. For instance, nighttime soaps were still on air. Dallas and Dynasty competed for the top spot as America's favorite primetime drama. Unfortunately, it was Dallas that came out as the victor. Dynasty was canceled in 1989. Medical dramas also made their rounds on air, such as St. Elsewhere, which of course went on to start and further the careers of Denzel Washington and William Daniels, respectively. As for sitcoms, the latter half of the 80s had some quite interesting offerings, especially in syndication, where there would be a slew of sitcoms airing that were once primetime darlings at one time, such as WKRP in Cincinnati, Too Close for Comfort, and the sequel series to What's Happening Now, which now had Roger as an adult with a wife coming back to live in the house that he grew up in. Syndication also managed to get some great family sitcoms such as Out of This World, which starred Evie, played by Maureen Flanagan, who finds out that her long-lost father is actually an alien. Living with her mother, played by Donna Pescow, she discovers that she has powers just like her dad and uses them to get out of trouble. She was joined by her best friend, Lindsay, and her uncle Bino, played by the late Joe Alasky, as she navigates her days growing up as a teenager and struggling with being different. She also managed to ask her father, Troy, for life advice through a cube in her room. That voice coming from that cube was the late, great Burt Reynolds, by the way. Out of This World was a different type a syndicated sitcom. See, the networks had started to get into making syndicated content as well. They even managed to show those efforts on their channels before primetime TV started. The network that had their hands in this sitcom was NBC. As for a different type of nuclear family, this came in the form of a sitcom that was quite peculiar and a product of canceled series revival.
The new boy in the neighborhood lives downstairs and it's understood.
This is it, Charles in Charge. It stars the titular character played by a previous sitcom alum, Scott Baio. He had previously spent his time playing Fonz's little cousin Chachi on the hit ABC sitcom Happy Days, and briefly in his spin-off, Joni Loves Chachi. Speaking of that sitcom, Ellen Travolta was back to play his mom once again in the now syndicated sitcom. See, Charles in Charge had premiered on CBS previously, but it wasn't much of a hit on the network, and it was quickly canceled after only one season. Of course, in an attempt to salvage it, it was retooled for syndication. Gone were the Pembrokes. In were the Powells. Charles was a college student living in a house, serving as a living babysitter, previously for the Pembrokes, but soon discovers after coming back from his summer vacation, they had moved out west and a new family had moved in. And of course, in classic sitcom fashion, he was allowed to live there to take care of the Powell children and dispense moral lessons to Jamie, played by Nicole Eggert, Sarah, played by Josie Davis, and Adam, played by Alexander Polinsky. When Charles wasn't pulling off his duty, which was rarely, he hung out with his very dim-witted best friend, Buddy Lembeck, excellently played by Willie Ames, who previously had experience in acting in sitcoms. He was known for his role as Tommy Bradford in the classic 70s sitcom 8 Is Enough. But in Charles in Charge, he was mostly responsible for driving the patriarch of the family, Walter Powell, absolutely crazy due to his dim-wittedness. Charles in Charge was an example of taking a failed sitcom and breathing new life into it to make it a success. Charles in Charge lasted 4 seasons in syndication, which was quite the accomplishment back then. If viewers in the 80s wanted a little weirdness in their syndicated sitcoms, they were covered with Small Wonder, a sitcom about a robotics engineer by the name of Ted Lawson who decides that he wants something that can help him around the house doing chores. In other words, he builds a robot dubbed VC, as in Voice Input Child Identikit. But in an attempt to pass her off as his daughter, she is known as Vicky. This was an attempt to blend the wholesome family sitcom with a dash of science fiction, which of course was already popularized on TV at this point. His wife Joan and son Jamie played along, but the nosy neighbor Harriet Brindle, who had a crush on Jamie, made every attempt to pry into what was going on at the Lawson residence. At the behest of her mother, Bonnie, played by Edie McClurg. Despite the sitcom lasting for 4 seasons and becoming popular among children, Small Wonder wasn't exactly loved by critics. Today, it's highly regarded as one of the worst sitcoms ever made by critics. As they say with critics, take everything they say with a grain of salt. Nevertheless, it managed to paint the picture of the American family in the 80s almost too well. As for the networks, they managed to keep the family theme going, but with new variations to the formula. This would bring about the concept of the single-camera sitcom. For example, on ABC, The Wonder Years premiered on January 31st, 1988. It chronicles the life of Kevin Arnold, played by none other than Fred Savage. He grew up in a middle-class family in the late 60s with his dad, John, who was a hard-working man of the times, Norma, his loving wife, and his older brother, Wayne, who constantly pestered Kevin as any big brother would. Their sister, Karen, who was the oldest, also lived there for a short time. She was a product of the times. In other words, a hippie. Along with his best friend, Paul, and his high school crush, Winnie Cooper, Kevin navigated the trying times of that era. The Wonder Years was a coming-of-age story unlike anything ever seen on television up to that point. It blended a dose of comedy and drama as his adult self told us his past through narration, voiced by Daniel Stern. He would play a huge role in one of the biggest movies of the next decade. But here, he was pivotal to the experience that the Wonder Years provided, and it did indeed. The Wonder Years didn't only end up becoming a Nielsen Top 30 show for 4 seasons in a row, but it also won several Emmys at the time, including one for Outstanding Comedy Series. Considering what was competing with it at the time, this was a huge feat for a series that had won it with just 6 episodes in its first season. As you know, it's not hard to figure out that The Wonder Years was the blueprint for sitcoms going forward, and a game changer. ABC didn't only have one game-changing sitcom on the network. Later that year, on October 18th, 1988, ABC would premiere Roseanne on the network. This was a product of comedian Roseanne Barr, who was on a hot streak after her HBO special, so the network came knocking on her door. Alongside Matt Williams, Marcy Carney, and Tom Werner, the same visionaries that brought the highly successful Cosby Show, they brought Roseanne's vision of the American family to audiences around the country. And that they were. The Connors weren't the type of family that was usually seen on television. They represented an often neglected side of America, the low-class white family struggling to make ends meet. Besides Roseanne being played by Roseanne, of course, she was joined by Dan, her hard-working husband, played by John Goodman. Their kids, Darlene, the rebellious one of the family, played by Sarah Gilbert, DJ, the only son of the family and the youngest, and Becky, the boy-crazy but overachieving older sister, played by Lacey Goranson. They were also joined by their aunt Jackie, played by the talented Laurie Metcalf. The sitcom became a hit on ABC and reinvented the image of the white American family. ABC also had another ace in its sleeve, Miller Boyett Productions. Formerly just Miller Minkus Productions, they brought audiences shows such as Happy Days, Angie, Laverne and Shirley, and Mork and Mindy. Now, in the 80s, they were newly named when Boyett joined Miller to produce some new shows for television. They would premiere the classic sitcom Perfect Strangers in 1986 and their take on the nuclear family, 1987. It starred Danny Tanner, played by the late Bob Saget, as a widowed father trying to take care of his 3 young daughters in San Francisco, California. There are more Tanners out there in TV land, as we will see shortly. Anyway, Danny couldn't do it alone, so he got his best friend into the fold, Joey Gladstone, played by the multi-talented Dave Coulier, a man who surely had a major role in Saturday mornings. But here, this was his main gig. He was quite the goofy one, always doing impressions of cartoon characters to make the kids laugh. And his brother-in-law, Jesse Katsopoulos, played by John Stamos. He was the cool one, the one on the edge, but decided to slow down when his sister died. And had a pretty cool catchphrase.
Have mercy. Have mercy. Have mercy.
And you know who else had a cool catchphrase? Their littlest daughter, Michelle, little sister to another sitcom star at the time, Kirk Cameron. This was the ideal nuclear family at its finest. Always a moral to be dispensed. And even though they had their mishaps, they always passed it up at the end of the episode. It was always pure, clean fun. If that's not the usual family, then I don't know what is. It would go on to usher many more like it going forward. This was only the beginning for Miller Boyer Productions. Trust me on this one. NBC was just as ahead of the curve as ABC was. They presented their vision of the nuclear family as well. Let's take My Two Dads, for instance. It had two men taking care of a teenage girl named Nicole, played by Stacy Keenan. They found out that one of them is the father after the mother passes away. They decide that they will live together and become a family. Far-fetched? Of course. But it didn't matter. This was the 80s. Anyway, Paul Reiser played one of the dads. Along with Stacy, he will go on to a role in one of the most successful sitcoms in the next decade. Now, if you think that family setup was quite odd, NBC would premiere a family sitcom more odder than My Two Dads. On September 22nd, 1986, Alf would make its premiere on the network. It starred an alien, but not just any regular alien. This sure wasn't the type of extraterrestrial Steven Spielberg had brought to theaters prior. Instead, audiences at home got a wisecracking extraterrestrial from the planet Melmac, who crash lands in the garage of the Tanner family. I told you there was another family by the name of the Tanners. Very popular family name, I guess. But these Tanners weren't only just a regular family. They were also responsible for housing an alien life form, hence the name, Alf. But his real name was Gordon Shumway. And if you think that was bizarre, well, then his choice of delicacies was even more bizarre than him. Let's just say that cats were not safe around Alf. The series ended up becoming a huge hit on NBC, so much that the show had earned a spot in the Nielsen's top rankings for 20 weeks in a row. Alf was a star. He even got to visit the White House to see Nancy Reagan, the First Lady herself. Our resident alien was very popular with children as well. Yeah, that. Let's just say that this wasn't his only path on television. The traditional family sitcoms were still going strong at this time as well, such as Family Ties, Gimme a Break, or Mr. Belvedere, Who's the Boss, and The Cosby Show. But they also had a new one that joined the fold, Valerie. This sitcom starred a veteran sitcom alum, Valerie Harper, best known for her role as Rhoda Morgenstern in the classic sitcom The Mary Tyler Moore Show, and her spin-off Rhoda. So now she was back as a loving mother of 3 boys. The eldest son was played by none other than Jason Bateman. Yes, the brother to another sitcom darling at the time, Justine Bateman, best known for her role as Mallory from Family Ties. He was also a movie star at the time, starring in the very dismal and crinkly panned sequel to Teen Wolf. Valerie was also the loving wife to a husband who was an airline pilot. The season was a marginal success on the network. In other words, Valerie didn't last long. Well, the character. See, Valerie Harper had a falling out with the show's producers, and she ended up quitting the show. That would have been the end of it all. But as they say in show business, the show must go on, and that it did. Her character was killed off screen, and she would be replaced with a veteran actress, Sandy Duncan, playing the role of Sandy, of course, their aunt. The show was also renamed The Hogan Family. This had proven to be a great move, as the series lasted for 5 seasons on the network. By the tail end of the 1980s, a new player had entered the game.
Good evening.
And welcome to Fox!
Fox. Despite the new network not having much to offer upon its inception, it still managed to bring a vision of the American family unlike anything ever seen on television. Case in point, on April 5th, 1987, they brought viewers a sitcom like none other. Here it is, Married with Children. This unique take on the American family starred Al Bundy, played by Ed O'Neill, a man who worked as a shoe store salesman, selling women's shoes. Yikes. He was the husband of Peggy Bundy, played by Katie Segal, a wife who was quite the opposite of what the average housewife was. She didn't cook or clean, but she did find time to watch TV. And Al had 2 kids, Bud, played by David Faustino, who was quite the unpopular kid in school, but was like his dad in many ways. And Kelly, played by Christina Applegate, was the elder sister who wasn't intelligent in any sense of the word. Together, they lived in the suburbs of Chicago. Married with Children turned the traditional family concept on its head. The Bundys were not a loving family. They ridiculed each other any chance they had gotten. Well, most of it was pointed at Al, as he loathed his life and his job. As much as he loathed those things, he despised his next-door neighbors who were newlyweds even more, Marcy and Steve Rhodes, played by Amanda Bierce and David Garrison respectively. This was not The Cosby Show in the slightest, considering that the original title of the sitcom was supposed to be called Not the Cosbys. That alone speaks for itself. During its short time on air, it had garnered quite the controversy, with complaints from feminist groups and the like over its content, to a point where they wanted it to be canceled. Fortunately, this wouldn't happen, as Married with Children was a resounding success on the fledgling network. Like they say, controversy creates cash. The success of Married with Children would slowly start to usher in more sitcoms that were edgy. This was only the beginning of something that would change the entire television landscape. The blueprint for the dysfunctional family on television. Fox had also gave audiences something that hadn't been seen since the 60s on a network. This time, it would mash the sensibilities of the family sitcom and animation. This wasn't hard to guess. It's The Simpsons, a series that frankly doesn't need any introduction at this point. The Simpsons are a tried and true staple of American television, an institution. Depending on when you watch this, it's on its 35th season. Something quite unheard of ever on television, still to this day. The Simpsons, as its creator, Matt Groening, once described them as creatures of consumption and envy, laziness and opportunity, stubbornness and redemption, were a product of The Tracy Ullman Show, one of Fox's earliest successes. The Simpsons started out as skits on that variety show. Matt Groening was then commissioned by Fox to test the waters for a full-length animated series with a Christmas special on December 17, 1989. Of course, the rest is history, and has been to this day, with the series earning the title as the longest scripted television series and animated cartoon series ever in the history of television. It has amassed 750 episodes, and the way things are going now, it doesn't look like it's stopping anytime soon. But as usual, that was primetime television. So, what does all of this factor into the grander scheme of Saturday mornings? And most importantly, what was the state of Saturday morning programming on the networks during the latter half of the 1980s? Well,